Hey friends and digital marketers, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less when you manage projects on Wix Studio. You can work in sync with your team on one canvas. You can reuse templates, widgets, and sections across sites. You can create a client kit for seamless handovers and leverage best-in-class SEO defaults across all your Wix sites. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio to see more. Hi, I'm Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hanselminutes. Today I'm chatting with Stacie Frederick. She's a Chief Product Officer at Stanza Systems. How are you?
Doing well. How are you, Scott?
I am very well. I am always excited to talk to people with a ton of experience. You have been a CTO. You have been an SVP of software engineering. You've been a VP. You worked on Alexa. You have done a ton of stuff, and you have a master's in computer science. I noticed, though, that you are the Chief Product Officer. Do you get to choose what comes between the C and the O? Did you decide to be the CPO and not the CTO?
Yeah, actually, that was pretty explicit in this case. The founders were already CTO, had filled the position. And I didn't feel like because Stanza is very deeply rooted in SRE, that it was the right fit for me. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting is that the products we're building are really for the rest of development. And it's kind of like, how do you bring that deep SRE knowledge to the rest of your developers? And so I sit very much at basically the customer as a VP of Eng or even a CTO. And it's kind of like, how do we get into the head of the customer and that perspective of bringing reliability engineering to the rest of your development team and really to the rest of the SDLC?
On the show here, we love to expand our acronyms. SRE is Site Reliability Engineering and SDLC is the Software Development Lifecycle. So is it important for you as the Chief Product Officer at a site reliability company to have deep engineering experience? Because sometimes Chief Product Officers are just like Chief Empath, but they may not have expertise in the space. You have both.
Yeah, it's that's a great question. I will say in this case, the technical background and the engineering experience actually really help a lot because the products that we've been working on have been very technical so far. We started off with a rate limiting product, which is very deep in infrastructure. And so when you start talking about features and who's going to use it, how would they use it, what are the different, almost like environments where that product's going to be used is deep into the developer experience. So understanding that, it just fast forwards kind of your hearing of what customers are telling you, as well as how you then look at their problems and then propose solutions. So it does help a lot.
Do you think that it would be a weakness then if one were a chief product officer and had no experience in the space, or is that just going to slow them down?
I think it could be, in the best case, it's a slowdown if you have enough technical folks around you that can help you to do that translation. But more likely, it's going to be a hindrance because there is kind of that translation that needs to happen. And what I found is in talking with prospective Stanza customers is that it really helps actually to have an insider's view of what engineering organizations are like. Because there's a lot of, when someone tells you something about either their pain points or even their objectives for a team, it helps to understand like, oh, that's the product side talking, or no, that's the platform engineering team, or no, this SRE folks, they're really just in the operations and they're not as closely aligned with business objectives. And so to have that added context of understanding and being able to ask that question really helps a lot.
Yeah. At the top of the show, you mentioned the software development lifecycle. And I was talking with a friend earlier who is working on what they call intelligent applications that have AI sprinkled in.
Yeah.
But they said we are in the middle of a movement from modern apps to intelligent apps. And I said, describe to me what a modern app is. And they said that means a mature app that has mature software development lifecycle behind it. The days of deploying from Stacie's laptop are over.
Yep.
and before you say hello world, you have a proper life cycle around it. Do you think that's a fair statement?
In terms of, how did they describe it again? Mature?
Like a mature software development lifecycle with a CI/CD. Like there's still companies that aren't doing
for sure
continuous deployment right now. And I'm curious if you're trying to sell to an SRE product or a series of products to people, and they don't even know what SRE is because their maturity level is less. How do you get past that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a spectrum that every team sits on, and it's actually not even just the team. Sometimes it's the product, and sometimes it's the business. And what's interesting is gauging the sophistication across those three things, because hopefully if you're either leading a team, in the team, you're finding the right fit across all three of those. For example, CI/CD, like everyone thinks that, that's the thing we need to achieve. That is the gold standard. However, depending on where your business or product is, you may not be able to reach that for the right reasons in your business. I actually had a team that was trying to deliver releases faster, but they didn't really think about, well, our testing burden is so high because it's so manual. This releasing more often is actually killing us. And so it's finding the right fit, right, for where you're at. It's not just going kind of blindly after everyone's doing it, and this is supposed to be the right thing to do. But it's kind of like you have to evolve yourself in the right ways.
Aren't there absolutes though? Like, are we getting to a place like there's standards? I know that the analogy of architecture of building a house is like a pretty understood thing. We know how to build houses, but we're still inventing how to make software. It feels like in the last 5 or 10 years, maybe 5 years, we really understand how to build software. Like it's becoming so much more standardized. I would be surprised if an organization said that they couldn't do it that way for some reason, unless it was regulatory.
Yeah, I would say there are still areas of software where also like if you're in the early phases of a product, sometimes it doesn't pay cost-wise to actually automate all your testing. In which case, is CI/CD our most important thing right now? Maybe it's not. So it is finding that right fit for where you're at, both in terms of your products and the maturity of them. So definitely, if you are dealing with mature products, your business is very well understood, absolutely makes sense. But if you're still trying to figure out the business, and so therefore your software is still very much in flux, it may not make sense to automate everything. So there is a decision point. Yeah. There's a balance that you need to reach on that.
That's a very good you're challenging my perception of how, like there's always this sense of like absolutes. And I'm like, the engineer in me is like, well, if you've done it twice, it should be automated. And it's like, well, but if you're only doing it twice a month, it doesn't need to be automated. So that's an important check.
Yeah. And that's one of the things where I would say folks who have gone into early stage startups, like all of a sudden your assumptions have to be checked because the goals are very different in those early days versus, okay, now we actually we understand our business well enough. We know where we need to invest in our software, right, to make us efficient and to build the right features on top of and growth versus we don't yet know yet.
Mm-hmm. When you are trying to get that they call it product market fit, ultimately, it feels to me like product-led growth, which is one of these terms that everyone's using right now, which really just means make the product so delightful that people will tell their friends about it. Like whole books have been written about this, and MBAs get MBAs to say product-led growth. It just make it not suck. Make it so amazing that if you're sitting next to someone on an airplane, they're going to be like, oh my God, have you heard about Stanza? It's so good. Right? But ultimately, you want the purchasing experience for them to be just like, oh, we have to have this. We didn't even know we had this problem. Do you feel like you have an answer and you call them and you do those call downs, those interviews, and it's like, we have the answer for you and it's the Stanza, products? Or are you still probing for problems that they have you don't know about?
Yeah, we're still very much in the probing as well as almost like validating and verifying. It's similar to when you try to ask a question in multiple ways just to make sure that the signal you're getting it makes sense. Right. And it's not just someone's maybe opinion or thought at the time, but it really is, it's a good solid signal, right? There's some ground there.
Yeah. There's a wonderful product story that they always teach us in school, which is an angry person comes into the cell phone store yelling about how they can't hear anything and they want a big antenna. And they say, I'm not leaving here until you put a giant antenna on my phone. And maybe they have an iPhone. You imagine a big CB whip antenna. And then when they get them to calm down, they realize the issue is their signal and the clarity of the calls, and so they came in with a solution. How often do customers come at you with a solution, but that's not what they really want? They just have a problem that they don't have a solution for.
Yeah, actually, it's not uncommon, especially for teams and folks that are, if they're sitting in a problem and they are, right, as engineering teams, they're left to solve them. Mm-hmm. And so they're very much in solution space of how would we address this. And so oftentimes that's where they're coming into the conversation, is with that, I'm looking for a solution. I'm very fixed on it. It's got to be this, this, or this. And so part of that challenge then is to kind of open up the conversation, take the step back, and really get them to talk about, okay, if this is your problem, or this is the solution you think, let's back up into the problem that you're trying to solve. And then what's the full picture of that problem, to kind of understand, like, why are you going down this path into only this solution? So.
Right. And that's where you get into psychology and empathy, because it's like, I know that you think you want this. Rather than telling them you're wrong, you say, well, help me understand why. Yes. How did you get there? Yes. Why do you feel that that's Absolutely. What you want?
And that's where a lot of just curiosity comes in. And it's kind of like if you start to talk to someone and like you haven't found that place where you can ask a bunch of questions and just have that conversation with folks, is where you're like, okay, that's a little bit of a dead end. I need to go a different route to kind of open up, get back to like kind of the background or the underlying reason for the thing they're trying to solve for.
I just had this image in my mind of like Benjamin Cumberbatch, like trying to interview someone to figure out the mystery, and they cracked it. Like, do you ever feel like you have a moment when you're talking to a customer and then you finally figured out the murder mystery and you've cracked it because, now I understand why you think that. And that's where you got there. And now I know what we can build for you.
There's been a couple times with that, but sometimes it's like after the call. So after we have a bit of a debrief on this, they said this, but like they said they needed this, but then they didn't accept this type of approach. Or it was just like, sometimes there's this weird kind of blockage in a conversation. Mm-hmm. And so then oftentimes you come on a call and you're kind of like, that was weird. Like they definitely have this problem, but yet we're kind of open to like different types of solutions. And then sometimes as we talk about it among ourselves, it's kind of like, well, okay, if we understand where this person sits in an org in terms of what they can't do and what's available to them, sometimes that's how people get wedged into a certain solution. For example, if you're, in a platform team and you are left to build all the solutions, sometimes you are only looking at open source. Like, I haven't been given the freedom to look at vendor solutions, or I've got to find a way to make sure all those developers, they're going to actually use the thing. How do I make it appealing to them? And so people kind of narrow down their scope. And so that's where it's interesting to understand, okay, so how many developers are you dealing with? What is your biggest challenge? Is there adoption? Like, how do you deal with adoption? Is there training that you provide to your developers? Or, if you're doing an open source, you're trying to solve it yourself. Have you looked at other things? Would that be interesting?
And you're challenging their assumptions in all of those questions.
Yeah. It's just kind of asking the broadening questions.
Have you had times when either after the meeting where that feedback like caused you to totally change or pivot or go, wow, yeah, our strategy is wrong. We've now heard it from 10 people. We've now heard it from 20 people. We should go in this direction.
We definitely have had that. And we're actually working in that kind of space right now, where we went through and had our first kind of product that we were launching with, thought it was definitely a better offering than what was out there, a better rate limiting solution to talk about specifically. And what we were experiencing was lots of problem validation. So lots of uses for that product, but not hearing a lot of urgency around it, or people really saying, that is going to really help me to meet this like business objectives, right? That urgency. which is really key nowadays, right? In the where the market is, and everyone's just very focused on cost and not adding things. And so where we got to was what we're really seeing a lot of is also people not understanding. What was interesting is rate limiting is really like if you think about it, a very kind of almost generic engineering technique. And so it's kind of like, I got to a point where I talked about to enough people, is like, I know you've got the problem. It's just a matter of where this sits in your systems and how important it is to you, like whether that problem is actually visible to you. And so it was a matter of the recognition of that problem and how they're dealing with the problems they are having with their systems and the ways the business is pushing them to make different requirements within their system, like availability, a lot of those types of things. So what we got to was, okay, how do we use what people already have in order to give them more of this kind of better understanding of their systems and how to improve them. And so we actually shifted. We thought that our first product would actually allow us to have access to data that would then get us to be able to provide kind of these analytics and insights. Instead, what we're really hearing from customers is they've paid a lot of money for observability. They've gone through a huge effort to instrument all their software. And now it's like, we're not going to add another thing. So it's kind of like, okay, what do you do? Basically, everyone's swimming in data. If we could get access to that data, could we then provide you with insights about what your systems are and aren't doing? And so we actually fast forwarded what we thought would come later to do that sooner.
That term observability and also work that's happening in OpenTelemetry has been an explosion in the last couple of years. There are these terms that I use the term mouthfeel, like it's not fun to say CI/CD, but it's fun to say DevOps, and it's fun to say observability. And like there's whole conferences now about observability. And like, are these just the same thing we did before, except packaged and named better? But observability seems like a big deal. It seems like a fundamental new way of thinking about software that is allowing us to explore insights and get a sense of what's really happening in this large, complicated system.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's, again, I think of it as it's something within software engineering we've always had, like the need for instrumentation, logging. It's really not new, but it's to a new degree that we're doing that, right? And I think just broader acknowledgement that this needs to be at a much higher level than before because of the complexity and the fact that people can build lots of software really fast. So now all of a sudden your complexity grows really fast. And so it's how do we wrangle that with fewer and fewer people?
The fewer and fewer people thing is an interesting one. This is not the direction I thought we would go, but let me ask you this. There's all these people out there talking about the mythical 10x developer. And I actually wrote a whole blog post about how I reject that. Like, yeah, there's a couple of Joes and Janes out there that are geniuses. I get that. But you can't hiring a genius is not a strategy. I'm a pretty mediocre B+ programmer myself. I don't know how talented you are, but I do okay. I can get it done. But when the cloud and then containers and then CI/CD and understanding what was called extreme programming, but now then was agile, but now it's just good common sense. I feel like a 10x developer, but it's the tooling that made it happen for me. Yep. Is that a reasonable way to think about it?
Absolutely.
Like, man, a good tool can just unlock me and let me do the fun stuff and not the yucky stuff.
Yeah, if you think about, you probably don't have to go too far back, right, in your own development journey to think, how long did it take, like just a scale of time, to build simple applications, right? And when you started versus where it is today.
Hello World in 1992 was 91 lines of code. I know that. There was 91 to say hello world in Windows, and now it is one line of code.
Yes.
That's a silly metric. Absolutely. And they just buried it, but still, that additional layer of abstraction is magical.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it's within our careers, right? Not even a lifetime.
Oh, wow.
That has changed significantly. What's interesting in terms of from Stanza's viewpoint and what we see is we've spent a lot of time speeding up development, right? The coding part. What I would say we haven't added as much in terms of tooling and help is, okay, once it's live, Now, how are you going to, like all the post release? I would say we don't have those super tools to make that right as scalable in terms of if you've got a small team that can produce this much software, can that small team still run that and everything else they're building? And that's where there is a big pain point of, this is where I think a lot of teams, we get burnout, we get a lot of, it's kind of that, the dream lost of, yes, I can build a lot of software. There's a lot of interesting problems I can get to pretty easily now, but man, I'm dragged down by, I've got to deal with all the stuff in production and then it's like fiddling with all the different knobs in order to just keep the stuff running.
Yeah, the words that I hate the most are works on my machine, right? Like that's the thing. It always works on my machine. I feel like to a point, containerization solved a lot of that for me, but it's when you have now two containers and they're talking to each other about stuff. And that's when things get messy. I can make containerization is great. I've got containers I wrote 7 years ago that still run just fine. Because if you ship the whole computer, it's bound to work fine. But then you add in things like Dependabot in the GitHub world and security things. Like who knows if that's a safe container to run, but I know it'll run reliably. Yeah.
So the amount of, once you get into production, the amount of complexity there, I would say we have not helped ourselves as much as we've helped ourselves on the pre-release side. And so it is interesting that we have so much shift left. Like everyone wants to shift left. I would still say that's really hard to do.
Shift left is an interesting one. I feel like that people like to use that term a lot and try to figure out what shift left and shift right means. It almost feels like we use the term at work, hot potato. And then when you're really upset, it's flaming potato, where just teams are just like throwing this flaming potato back and forth. Ideally, yes, you want software and design and build and code to be where the bugs get found. But shifting right, also, you've got performance, reliability, resilience. Is it a tug of war or is it a shift left?
I think that's where the frequent use of shift left leads to a lot of tension. Because especially recently, like with all the tightening, right, of budgets and things like that and team shrinking. And so we are shifting left is often the positive way it's described. But it's like, if you haven't done significant work to actually change the way you're building software, are you really
or just dumping
left?
It on like the lowest paid engineer and making them hurt?
It's almost like you're more like abandoning the right.
Yeah.
And so other people, right, so then you're borrowing your development time in order to fill the work that needs to be done on the right.
Oh, you are borrowing your development time. That is absolutely what is happening. And then I think also back to the product perspective, if we're squeezing the budget for everything, how do you, making a product like this, convince the C-suite or whoever the decision maker is that like this is a product as opposed to it being a commoditized checkbox in some cloud? Right. There was a time when we used to fly a consultant in to do load balancing, and now load balancing is a checkbox. Then that happened, to your point, in my lifetime. How do you make sure that what you're building is going to be around for a long time and remain competitive as a product?
It's a good point, especially because the cloud is just shifting. Things in the cloud are just shifting so fast. Like if you only have to look at the last few years in terms of the developments. Often think about Kubernetes. And again, like just in a handful of years, right? It's changed significantly in terms of its adoption and commonplace, and everyone uses it now. But that the whole cloud landscape is constantly just moving. And so for everyone to keep up is really hard, which is where what's interesting for Stanza is what we are trying to do is to help all the humans, right? To get to that faster comprehension and to be able to manage in a simpler, easier way all the information that is within production and operations data. And so we feel like that is actually almost like the next area we all need to tackle, is that we've given ourselves, we've done a great job in terms of instrumentation. We call it signals, in comprehensions and actions. done a great job on the signals part. Lots of data. Fantastic. We actually are doing pretty good in actions in terms of there's many things you can do in your infrastructure, cloud, managed services. The question is what sits in the middle in terms of translating that information, that signal, to then decide what to do in terms of the actions. And this is where we still rely on our senior folks to spend time to say, okay, go sift through the data and see where this problem might be, or why this system is so flaky, or why when we went through that last promotion, the thing fell over. But it's a very targeted thing, and it's very human-based because they're taking the context of all the different systems. What can I ignore? What do I pay attention to? What do I know about these systems? Like this one I know is weird, so I start looking at that one first. And so we're trying to systematize that a little bit so that then teams are actually getting more value out of all their signal and actually having a little bit of almost a better idea of where should you be focused on, a little bit of a prioritization list in terms of what is going to be, hey, did you know this particular service, things around it have changed enough? That one is actually your riskiest one now. And trying to give those clues.
Your CEO, Neil Murphy, said that one of the goals of Stanza has been to put the wisdom of SRE into software. And I really feel like that is an extension of the idea of the software development lifecycle. Like there was a time when they would give you a Word document and say, here's the Word document, and it's how you build. But Word documents don't break the build, and they don't do anything. They're not codified. They're just Word documents. And there's a lot of wisdom and shared stories and people with a high bus factor who leave the company. And then you're like, oh my God, I had no idea. Stacie knew where everything was. Now that she's gone, what do we do? Getting that wisdom into software so that the next generation can better understand these large systems seems to be what you're trying to accomplish at Stanza.
Yeah, it's also even just how to think about these systems, right? In terms of, if you think about your more junior engineers, sometimes what they're learning most from your senior folks is, how do I think about the problems? So we're seeing this behavior, but then how do I go about, dissecting it and debugging it? And then how do I gauge all the options I have in terms of how to solve it? And so that's what we are trying to put into, as Niles says regularly, put into software so that we can give better pointers, at least get you off to a jumping point faster, right, than starting from nothing.
Yeah. I was talking to my intelligent apps friend, Maria, and she was talking about how we're going to be able to interview infinitely patient AIs about our applications. Like it would be nice to be able to, for a junior or early in career person, to be able to just sit there and talk to something about the app and brainstorm with an infinitely patient. And I put a real emphasis on that idea of infinitely patient. Because I don't want to call Stacie and say, hey, there's a problem with Hanselman again. What is this guy? Keep calling me. But you've got the insights. I want to know what's going on. Why is the app behaving
it's absolutely
like this?
True. What would be interesting too is if that, and this is where, particularly for Niall, having been one of the authors for the SRE book, is you could have your AI assistant also swallow a couple books, right, and add that in. To me, when I think about that, I'm like, so what does that mean for books?
Yeah. Well, what does it mean for junior engineers too? I want it to mean it makes them better, faster.
Absolutely.
I don't want it to mean that they don't have to think anymore.
Oh, that's a good point. And I do think that's often what we learn the most when we sit side by side, right, with the senior engineer, is the thought process and the breakdown of our problem.
Yeah. That is so important. My nephew just got his very first job out of university, and he's an electrical engineer. And he was initially very excited about working from home, but it turns out that the office is about 4 blocks away, and all of the other electrical engineers are a bunch of multi-gendered graybeards of varying flavors that are all kind of like in their 50s. And I'm like, you got to go to the office and you got to suck these people dry.
Yes.
They know so much. Hang out with them and sit over their shoulder and say, what are you doing there? What's that do?
Yeah.
Because you're the next graybeard.
Exactly. and it's interesting because that's where observation, sometimes just watching.
Yeah.
Also when it goes about poking around a problem.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's the most insightful stuff that you get. from that
Yeah.
interaction.
Yeah. And, whether you do that remotely over a video call like we're doing now, being able to talk to someone who can get you the answers you want and get you that sense of why is the site doing this is going to just make you a better engineer for the next SRE issue.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today. This has been an absolute joy.
Yeah. Thanks, Scott. Enjoyed this.
We've been chatting with Stacie Frederick. She's a CPO at Stanza. You can check them out at www.stanza.systems. Stanza.systems. Check them out online. This has been another episode of Hanselminutes, and we'll see you again next week.